Obviously, Brazil has a huge potential in terms of resources, institutional.
Olá, este é o Poder Entrevista. Eu sou o Guilherme Valtenberg e vou entrevistar o gerente de sustentabilidade para as Américas da Iata, que é a Associação Internacional do Transporte Aéreo, Pedro de la Fuente. Fuente tem 39 anos e está na associação há 14. É especialista em relações internacionais e aviação, setor que acompanha há mais de 2 décadas. Ele representa as companhias aéreas nos debates da COP30. Essa entrevista será 3, 2, 1. Essa entrevista será realizada em inglês, mas virá com legendas para permitir que todos acompanhem toda a conversa. Pedro, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you for having me. So it should be here with you.
Agradeço também a todos os web espectadores que assistem a este programa. Essa entrevista está sendo gravada no estúdio do Poder 360 em Brasília, em 6 de novembro de 2025. E para ficar sempre bem informado, inscreva-se no canal do Poder 360, ative as notificações e não perca nenhuma informação relevante. E eu começo essa entrevista perguntando: Global aviation has committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. What concrete progress does Iata expect to present at COP30?
Thank you for that question, Guilherme. And obviously, from an international standpoint, we follow the discussions at COP very closely because any domestic policy will have an influence on our international agreements. So for COP, our main goals and priorities will surround around the enabling of the carbon markets, just to ensure that the aviation industry at the international level is able to comply with the carbon offset and reduction scheme for international aviation next year in its first phase, and ensuring that states see the urgency of issuing letters of authorization and corresponding adjustments to allow the flow of these units to international aviation to comply with this program. The second thing is drawing attention towards our main pillar to decarbonization and its focus on energy transition, in the realms of sustainable aviation fuels, and seeing how we can progress and accelerate the transition towards these new fuels. And the third thing is ensuring that international aviation is not a means by which states impose taxes that will derail fundings needed to ensure a proper aviation transition to a sustainable future. So those are our key main priorities for COP, and reasons why we're following so close the discussion this year in the event that's taking place here in Belém.
Okay, so well, you just mentioned taxes, right? So one of the goals, one of the Brazilian goals as the host of COP30 is to try to put together 1.3 trillion dollars a year. And one of the means in order to tackle global warming is to to establish new tariffs and to tax more aviation and maritime transport. How does that initiative may impact the sector as a whole?
Obviously, in the realms of aviation, we actually stand united behind the principles of cooperation, transparency, and fairness that are really underpinned under the United Nations body of International Civil Aviation Organization. And when it comes to taxing international aviation, this really has a major impact in our efforts to decarbonize, because behind these national domestic initiatives are disguised fundings for programs that are not necessarily related to aviation. And this year's announcements at COP of generating a global solidarity levy task on international premium and private jets, which aims to generate around $78 billion on a year-to-year basis on an industry that really profits about around $32.4 billion, and this is the estimate in 2024, it doesn't make any changes. So airlines actually have a very structurally thin profit margin, and at around 3.4% on an average worldwide, and including these type of penalizations not only hinder the growth of the industry, but actually divert fundings towards our own decarbonization strategies. So that's where it's so important that to reiterate that we as an aviation industry stand committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050 and actually are ready to invest $4.7 trillion in a period between 2024 and 2050. But penalization and putting these taxes really would hinder that effort.
Thank you. And now, thinking about Brazil, what role can Brazil play in helping the sector meet this goal of being carbon zero by 2050?
Obviously, Brazil has a huge potential in terms of resources, institutional strength, and also the flexibility to work at an international level in multilateralism, such as the one now being hosted for COP. Particular interest for the industry is the development in Brazil of the bioeconomy and in the inclusion of the production of sustainable aviation fuels into the country's objectives for decarbonization as a whole. Given the vast experience that the country has today in programs as Renovabil and the inclusion now of aviation within these programs, we see that it could really play an important role into the future in accelerating the production on sustainable aviation fuels. And I really want to draw attention on sustainable aviation fuels because when we talk about sustainable aviation fuels, we're not just talking about any fuel or biofuels. We're talking about fuels that really meet a stringent environmental criteria where we're not putting at risk food security and we're really contributing to the energy security of the countries. And over the last year, we were only able to produce around 1.3, 1.4 million liters of SAF. And this only represents actually around 0.2% of the total aviation fuel demand. And our aim is actually to reach 500 million tons of production by 2050 and leveraging on countries that have already an experience in producing biofuels, such as Brazil, with a vast majority of resources and feedstock. It's really something that we really need to focus on and accelerating that production and potential that the country has.
Okay, so in a recent study published in September by Iata in partnership with Worley Consulting, it is stated that the world has the means to produce the 500 million tons of SAF needed. What is still missing to make that happen?
So from a production standpoint is capacity and investments in these new technologies. We demonstrate with the study that IATA has published that we are able to produce and meet the decarbonization goals of the industry. However, policy is instrumental in accelerating and giving the confidence to investors to produce this SAF, and particularly in Latin America and pertaining to Brazil, Brazil really today stands out as a global leader thanks to its vast biomass resources and actually the advancements that the biofuel sector has had over the last 30 years. And with the supporting energy policies that the country is putting forward, it could really put them in a leading role within the Americas in the production of sustainable aviation fuels. So some of the key findings that we actually see from this report and it is that Brazil really leads the region with an estimate of between 9 to 12 billion liters of potential SAF production from sustainable feedstocks available by the year 2035. And if this is something that can be scaled, it can go beyond 20 billion liters by the year 2050. So with an industry that will require 500 million liters, million tons of SAF in 2050, it really represents a good number and potential benefit for the economy, local economy, to invest in sustainable aviation fuels as a future.
And what kind of public policies do we understand or incentives are needed to unlock this market and make it globally competitive?
Obviously, when we talk about policy, the really or the most important portion that we need to focus on is costs. And under the Combustíveis do Futuro law and incentives in Brazil are already being considered, but they're not necessarily being translated today into bridging the gap between conventional fuel and sustainable aviation fuel. In terms of where we see the production today in with the policies in the European Union, we can assess that SAF in the market is 2 to 3 times more expensive than conventional aviation fuel. And in a market such as Brazil, where fuel costs are already higher than in any other place in Latin America, policy really needs to drive at the to close that gap between the production of one fuel over the other without sacrificing what we call the third generation or the third revolution of aviation, which is the democratization of the sector, allowing for more passengers to be able to access the benefits of aviation at a really reasonable price without having to decrease that connectivity and because of the spike that sustainable aviation fuel could bring in airlines operating costs into the market. So the main focus of the when we talk of policy, no matter where it comes from, a mandate in emissions reductions or a mandate in blending, the aviation industry needs support in terms of investments that will reduce the cost of the fuel to ensure that we continue to offer at a reasonable price access to aviation in developing economies.
Well, one of the issues that we have in this area is that Europe continues to impose barriers, claiming that producing plant-based SAF could threaten food security, a claim many consider to be unfounded. Is there any chance this stance might change anytime soon?
From an European standpoint, the policies are today currently being reviewed, but at the international level, within aviation's control and under the guidance of ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, we have made sure that any fuel that we call sustainable or SAF, it is sustainable. And it doesn't only meet the stringent environmental criteria in terms of water usage, human right labors, land use changes, but it also the core concept is that it will not put in jeopardy food security. So no fuel that the aviation industry will use as sustainable in the future will impose those contradictions, and that is something that we're trying to demonstrate to the European Union, that the production of SAF today is not putting in jeopardy that food security, and that they're meeting the stringency and sustainability criteria to ensure that we're not taking away resources that can be used for feeding the global population, but rather using agricultural waste, municipal solid waste, and other innovative feedstocks that really could accelerate the decarbonization of the aviation sector.
Beyond SAF, Iata has been monitoring new technologies such as hydrogen and electrification. Which of these alternatives appear most promising at this point, and in what time frame could we expect a paradigm shift in aviation?
So when it comes to hydrogen and electrification, the main constraint or barrier of entry of the technology is that they require significant changes to the existing infrastructure and operations that we know today. So we will need newer aircraft concepts to come into production before we even start using hydrogen or batteries to fly. And secondly, how can these be incorporated within the aviation ecosystem within the airports? So what we bet on newer technologies to meet our decarbonization goals by 2050. They will represent about 13% of the total emissions that we can reduce by mid-century. However, the entry of these technologies is delayed, and we will not be able to see them until the 2035, 2040 time frame when they're really going to be into production and scalable to introduced in our day-to-day operations. So right now, the only technologies that we rely to meet these this decarbonization goal is really on sustainable aviation fuels and that transition to these newer fuels.
Some airlines have turned to carbon offsetting to mitigate emissions in the short term. Does Iata see this as an effective mechanism, or does it understand it risks becoming a form of greenwashing?
So from in general aviation investments in out of sector measures such as carbon offsets, it is the last resources that we rely on. Our main net zero roadmap focuses on in sector measures. So operational efficiencies, newer technologies, fleet renewals. We talk about as well the incorporation of sustainable aviation fuels alongside this interview, and also and how can these new technologies contribute to that goal. But any residual emission will have to come from offsettings. And when it comes to offsets, we really ensure that these are stringent in that are emissions that are really occurring and that can be accounted for, and therefore avoiding any mentions or say of accusations of greenwashing. All the carbon offsets that aviation use today meet a stringent criteria approved by ICAO, and these are also projects that can demonstrate a methodology that they are achieving significant reductions rather than other projects that have been used in the past. So before we even invest in some of the carbon projects, that to be true, um, some airlines will have to rely more on carbon offsets than other because of the access that we have that they would have to newer technologies, and therefore rely on the carbon markets. But ensuring that any investments in the carbon market will follow a sustainable guidance methodology and criteria that these emissions are actually occurring, and that we're paying a fair amount to invest in these projects.
Perfect. Now, one very last question, specifically about Brazil. The so-called Brazil's Future Fuel Project, Combustível do Futuro, aims to foster the development of biofuels on a larger scale. What bottlenecks or challenges does this initiative still face in IATA's point of view?
So the main bottleneck today is the transition to the production of these newer fuels. I mean, Brazil has already estimated that the production of SAF can start as soon as 2026, but at a very fraction of the need that the aviation industry would need to meet with the goal in starting in 2027. And the second challenge that the industry faces with these initial projects that have been announced is in terms of the production costs and how these costs can affect the national sector, where we're talking about the cost can exceed the 2,000 US dollars per ton of sustainable aviation fuel, when on average we pay around 600 to 800 dollars per ton of fossil fuel. So this is an increase of almost threefold, fourfold in our operating cost. So without fiscal support, such as tax exemptions, lower carbon fuel standards, or credit generating mechanisms, these cost gaps can make compliance with the Combustível Futuro law economically unsustainable for the domestic aviation sector.
Pedro, thank you very much for this interview in this very special moment, since COP30 is already ongoing.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Agradeço também a todos os web espectadores que assistiram a este programa. Essa entrevista foi gravada no estúdio do Poder 360 em Brasília, em 6 de novembro de 2025. E para ficar sempre bem informado, inscreva-se no canal do Poder 360, ative as notificações e não perca nenhuma informação relevante. Muito obrigado e até a próxima.
Obviously, Brazil has a huge potential in terms of resources, institutional strength, and also the flexibility to work at an international